Good afternoon. I'm Buck Kernan from the Institute of Land Warfare. On behalf of AUSA and Institute of Land Warfare, I want to welcome you to an extremely relevant panel this afternoon. We'll probably still have some people drifting in because some of us just coming from the luncheon where the Secretary of Defense just finished talking, so bear with the opening and closing of the door. A couple of admin announcements. Those of you who have questions, cards have been provided. Please fill out your questions and then fill them in, and they'll be provided to the panel for them to address. If your question's been ignored, it's probably because it's too difficult for them to answer. Seriously, hopefully we'll have enough time to address all the questions in here. On a different note, on the seats out here, we have a very special program going on here right now for AUSA for membership. If you're not a member of AUSA, you got a special rate of only $10 to join AUSA. General Sullivan and AUSA is only as powerful as the membership that we enjoy. We encourage you, if you're a member, thank you very much. Continue your membership. If you're not, we encourage you to take advantage of this very special offer. Fill out that card, take it down to that booth, and they'll take very, very good care of you. Now, we have a very, very important panel today. We just finished listening to the Secretary of Defense talking about, hybrid warfare, and in particular, what cyber brings to the table. There's an awful lot of concern out there, both in the industrial side as well as the military side. How do we protect ourselves? What's the offensive and defensive aspects of this? We've got a very distinguished panel here that can address these issues. This is something that throughout my career we weren't really concerned about. ComSec was an issue, yes, but today, with our reliance on all the systems that we rely on to fight and win our nation's wars and protect the homeland, cyber has become extremely important, and we are blessed to have some true subject matter experts here. And with that, I'll turn it over to our panel chairman, Lieutenant General Cardon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone here today. Thanks. This is the third panel. We've been able to do this every year. I'm aware it is Wednesday afternoon, and I just really appreciate your attendance. I'm going to make some brief remarks and then introduce the panel. And I'm going to start off with the tremendous advances that have been made in Army cyber over the last year. So first, if you were sitting in these chairs 2 years ago, we would have had 2 teams of 41 that the Army's building of the 133 for the Department of Defense. Last year there were 10 teams, and this year there's 32 teams, and by next summer there'll be 41 teams. That's pretty stunning progress. The second is the Army last year decided to stand up a Joint Force Headquarters cyber down at Fort Gordon, Georgia. It started with a Brigadier General and 1 person. That's 123 strong of 129 authorized, and it's fully operationally capable today. In terms of operations and network modernization, we already have the first parts of the Joint Information Environment appearing, and that's going to really help us protect our networks by hardening our networks. A year ago, 1st of September, the Secretary decided to create a new branch, 17, called Cyber. And on 1 October this year, we have roughly 1,000 people in the branch today. And for those of you that have seen us create branches before, think about how hard that was for the Army to do. The last branch that was created was 1987, Special Forces. I would say that worked out quite well for us. So the first new branch of the 21st century for the Army is cyber. The Army stood up the Army Cyber Institute. Last year it had about 2. Today it has about 50. That's to look forward strategically, look over the hill for the future of cyber. And under the leadership of General Fogarty, who's on this panel today, the Cyber Center of Excellence has really emerged over the last year, and I think you're going to hear some very exciting things happening there. That said, when you look at the society today and the way that cyberspace has impacted every facet of our society, so too has it done to the military. And the way I describe this, it's a bit odd because it's actually extremely disruptive. But at the same time, it has these elements of convergence in the military. And what I mean by that is, it's not cyber for the sake of cyber, but cyber integrated into other means, but is especially challenging information operations, electronic warfare, signals intelligence, network operations. All of that is converging in ways that would have only been dreamed of 5 years ago. So what I would say is while we made all this progress over the last year, that technology is moving really fast, and I believe we need to go faster. And so to talk some about this today, we have a great panel. So first I'd like to introduce Dr. Singer, who I've known for some years, quite a visionary thinker. Most recently wrote the book Ghost Fleet, but not just that, wrote the book Wired for War on Robots before robots were popular. Before that, wrote the book about contractors on the battlefield before that was popular, and he's always been at the leading edge. The nonfiction book on cybersecurity also is quite good. I recommend both, and he'll be our moderator for today. Next to him is Isaac Porche. I asked Isaac to come. I've had numerous conversations with him. One of the leading experts, I believe, in information operations and tactical cyber, include offensive cyber operations. Next to him is Steve Fogarty, who I've known for a long time, and just one of the most incredible intelligence officers we have in our Army, and has had the distinction of really transforming the signal center of excellence into the cyber center of excellence. I said transform. It doesn't mean we don't need signal, absolute excellence in signal. It's just much like we've done at the other places, the maneuver center, the mission command, etc. There's sub-elements to that, and Steve has really done some tremendous work there. Next to him is Colonel Joe Hartman. Joe leads the offensive cyber forces for the Army, and he's been in command about 14 months, and most recently has worked what we call support, tactical cyber in support of cyber in support of Corps and below. And finally, on the end, we have Major General Paul Nakasone. Paul commands the National Mission Force for U.S. Cyber Command. I sometimes describe it as the JSOC of cyber, so you get a sense for what it is, and he will close us out today. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Singer.
Thank you first for the incredibly kind introduction, and to all of you for coming out. This is clearly an important topic, and I think what strikes me is that you can see the interest in it growing. And I would project, if you said I'm a futurist, I will project it will continue to grow. And I was struck by the title of the panel is Army Cyber Today and Tomorrow. And that notion of today and tomorrow I think is fascinating, because cybersecurity is a field, a space, a domain, however you want to frame it, that's shaped by incredibly amazing trends. When today's 20-year-old soldier or the insurgent that they were facing was born, there were fewer than 20,000 websites compared to the 1.1 billion websites that are out there today. The number of total internet users 20 years ago was 36 million. Today, there's more than 3 billion internet users logged online, living everywhere from, in terms of, if you think of the population, it's greater than North America, South America, Africa, and Europe put together. But so too the risk side has grown. 20 years ago, the total number of computer viruses that had been created had just crossed the amazing 10,000 mark. Last year alone, 317 million new pieces of malware were created just in that year. There was no cyber command, Army Cyber Command, all the different units and organizations that you see up here. Today, there are at least 100 nations with some kind of security or military capacity in this realm. On the budget side, the word cybersecurity was most definitely not in the DoD budget back then. Last year, it was in the DoD budget 146 times. And on the business side, the cybersecurity industry was just a couple of nascent security firms, mostly doing antivirus work. Today, it's an industry that's poised to reach over $160 billion worth of revenue. And that's where we are right now. What about moving forward? And I think we're going to see a number of shifts that are going to shape the strategic, the operating, the tactical environment in a number of ways. One, for example, is just the raw number of devices that are coming online. At least 30 billion new devices in the next 5 years, to the exponential number of sensors that will be linked to those devices, literally over 1 trillion sensors out in the world collecting information around us. Now, this collective growth is not just accelerating, it's also concentrated in the areas where conflict is most likely, the developing but increasingly connected world. 78% of the mobile and cellular subscriptions and 2/3 of internet users reside in developing nations. We'll see essentially a tripling of mobile broadband connections by the year 2020. Another way of thinking about it is, according to the National Intelligence Council, more people in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia will have access to the internet than they will full-time electricity. And should Silicon Valley's dreams bear fruit, this pace could even quicken further, such that we will have drone-delivered bandwidth beaming down in the same airspace as drone-delivered Hellfire missiles. Pull back and think about that for a minute. So there are just an utter, amazingly array of questions and issues that surround these trends, which surely do define and shape the theme of this overall conference on how do we win in a complex world. And they range from recruiting to organization to doctrine to law to ethics. And we've put together, I think, an exceptional panel to go into this. And I'm going to give a little bit deeper introductions because I think it really is important to get a sense of where the speakers are coming from and the unique experiences they bring to bear. So first we have Dr. Porche. He's a technologist at RAND who's been the principal investigator for a number of projects on network and communication technology, IT acquisition, cloud computing, cybersecurity, modeling, simulation, computer network defense. Notably, he's also a member of the Army Science Board and a judge for Automotive News PACE Award. That's because his past employment was in the automotive and transportation sector, where he studied the security of in-vehicle networks, which is, of course, another new issue of cybersecurity that any owners of Jeeps in the room might be familiar with. Next, we have Major General Fogarty, who, as was said, is commander of the Cyber Center of Excellence. He comes from a background in military intelligence and has served in a wide range of roles and locales in his career, including with the 101st Airborne, 75th Ranger Regiment, Special Operations Command, multiple tours and deployments in Afghanistan, as well as Director of Intelligence J2 for Central Command and Special Assistant to the Director of the Army Staff. We have Colonel Hartman, commander of the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade. And he too brings in a background that, to me, again, as a civilian, is fascinating because it illustrates the wide range of locales and responsibilities that the Army has taken, again, in that past generation, and maybe an illustration of where we're moving forward. So, for example, he served as an infantry platoon leader in the 82nd Airborne during Operation Desert Storm, with Southern European Task Force, where he provided intelligence support to non-combatant evacuation operations in Liberia, Albania, Zaire. Zaire doesn't even exist as a country anymore. And finally, human operations, counterintelligence, long-range surveillance with Ranger Regiment deploying multiple times in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, and in Korea as commander of a military intelligence battalion. And then finally, we have Major General Nakasone, commander of Cyber National Mission Force. He's held command and staff positions across all the levels of the Army with assignments in the United States, Republic of Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, commanding on company, battalion, and brigade level, serving as senior intelligence officer at the battalion, division, and corps level. His most recent overseas posting was Director of Intelligence J2 ISAF, and prior to taking command of the Cyber National Mission Force, he served as Deputy Commanding General, U.S. Army Cyber Command. So an amazing array of expertise. I'm looking forward to this panel. A reminder to all of you again in the audience, please go ahead and write down your questions on cards, and they'll gather them and I'll read them out. And I've also put a call out in the cyber world for questions to come in from Twitter. So a warning that we'll be hearing from outside the world appropriate to this topic. So, Doctor?
Peter, thank you, and General Cardon, thank you for having me on this panel. It really is quite an honor to be on the same panel with these distinguished leaders. I'd like to start out by doing something dangerous for an engineer, and I'm an engineer, and that is to quote literature. My apologies to my fellow engineers, but I think you understand. So I'll quote Mark Twain, who was a writer, but he was also an inventor. He knew Tesla and Edison. And he said this: "There's no such thing as a new idea, it's impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas, put them in a sort of mental kaleidoscope, we give them a turn, and they make new and curious combinations. And then we keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely. But they are the same old pieces of colored glass that have been in use through all the ages." In preparation for this talk, I listened to General Cardon's speech at TechNet last August, where he really gave this detailed review of the countless efforts to define and redefine information operations doctrine going back to 2003. And with that churning in mind, Twain's line about turning and making new combinations indefinitely comes to mind, both as a challenge, because we don't want to get paralyzed by deliberation, but also an opportunity that there are new thoughts and new ways to do things that we can pull from our current intellectual capital. I've been at RAND 17 years as an analyst, and I've been focused on cyber and the Army for most of it. So at best, that makes me an informed spectator to the work that's being done by these officers on this panel and their predecessors and their staffs. And certainly cyber is older than my professional career. This was made clear to me almost 10 years ago. I hosted a cyber workshop at RAND, maybe not 10, maybe 7, and Colonel Hartman will appreciate that. In attendance was INSCOM Commander Major John DeFreitas, and in response to our discussion about a new cyber command that the Army might stand up, he reminded us, and I think I wrote this down, we've been doing cyber for a long time, we just haven't called it cyber, and frankly, I don't like to talk about it. And then he talked about it for 3 days. The point is, information operations, cyber, and all the intersecting areas, they've all been studied well for the last 2 decades. And there are a lot of good ideas. There's some not so good ideas, but a lot of good thought that we can choose from. So today, I've drawn my remarks from a handful of Army-sponsored studies that I've conducted over the last 7 years. And let me tell you the order of my comments. First, I'll review a little bit what General Cardon talked about, past accomplishments for the Army, because they are truly incredible, but also the challenges that we've tried to address along the way. And then I'll talk about some of the trends that are coming up that we have to deal with that are leading us to what General Fogarty calls convergence, and others, convergence of people, data, and transport. And then finally, I'll talk about some of the ideas that could help towards the challenges we talk about. So why are we here? In Augusta at TechNet, General Fogarty defined convergence, and again, there were multiple definitions, but I'll go with yours, sir, because you're closest to me. And you wrote it down, actually. And it is the effective merging or integration of distinct staffs, network systems into a unified whole to achieve decisive results. Now, that definition and other research leads me to say this: issues in cyberspace can be boiled down to 2 major ingredients: people and technology. That there are more, but it really gets no simpler than that. And the challenges and the opportunities in cyber come from those 2 categories. So let me rehash some of the Army's past achievements. It's important. 20 years ago, the Army stood up the Land Information Warfare Activity and Information Dominance Center. And their mission reflected what was an old definition of information warfare, and I'll read it to you. Actions taken to achieve information superiority by affecting adversary information, information-based processes, information systems, and computer-based networks while defending one's own. That's an old definition, but it's amazing how relevant it is today. It's not doctrinal, but it's still relevant. 5 years ago, the Army recognized a deficiency in focus among its personnel for cyber defense. This is the dual hat problem, where folks had to keep the network up and defend it at the same time. So the Army created an MOS for defenders and warrant officer positions for defenders. That's great. And around the same time, the Army recognized that it had to enforce a lot of the cybersecurity rules that existed. I visited in one of my studies many of the IT centers at various posts for the Army, and there was a time where I could not find personnel who knew of any soldier who was ever disciplined for any cybersecurity infraction. So there was a time where folks would take classified laptops, put it on the internet, take it back to a SCIF, and it wasn't that it wasn't known, it was just there was no punishment for it. That changed, the culture is changing. And 2 years ago, a gap in doctrine and organization was addressed. The Army wrote FM 338, Cyber Electromagnetic Activities. And of course, as General Cardon has said this year, there's dealing with the retention issue by having the expertise kept in this new career branch, Career Management Field 17, and lots of other milestones. 2010, our cyber was stood up, and the Cyber Mission Force and the Cyber Center of Excellence was stood up. Just incredible progress that's going on. But what has not been addressed, it's been identified over and over, but not addressed, is the overlap that exists between these related areas in the Army. NetOps, information operations, electronic warfare, intel, spectrum operations. There are side effects to having them separate, the rice bowls, and when you think about General Fogarty's definition of convergence, I focus on this phrase he uses, having a unified whole, because I suspect he's getting at that in this objective. Regarding unified whole, I think a useful term is interoperability. That is defined in our lexicon, and it may be the key requirement to enable collaboration and information sharing amongst these areas. But the fundamental challenge for collaboration and information is this. It's really easy when the personnel share the same location, the same security clearance level, the same language, the same experiential background, the same information technology, and the same common vocabulary. And that's rarely the case. Now, if we had a blackboard, I can tell you right now, General Fogarty would have it filled. And if you had seen any of his sketches before, you will see that he's got a sketch for convergence in the talk, in the tent, the 2, the 6, and everybody else in those swim lanes I mentioned are positioned together in the same corner. And I can say, when you go through my checklist, co-locating those personnel really does get all the way through. But a notable exception is a common vocabulary, and that's a really key aspect to interoperability. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a 20-year-old manual that the DoD put out on interoperability, and it's 140 pages of 5 different levels of interoperability, and it's quite interesting. The lowest level of that is swivel chair interoperability. In the early days of Iraq, the swivel chair allowed coalition partners to turn to different classified systems and share information about planning their missions. And they thought it was useful for planning. I'll get back to that. The next level up was sort of level 1, which was physical connectivity. Well, we have that today. It's the Ethernet. It's in our homes. We've had it for 3 decades. But if you read through this manual, and I don't advise it, it's an encyclopedia, but the highest level is this knowledge level, this common view of the world, which is sort of the holy grail of interoperability. We're not there yet. But how we get there is to get over this hurdle, going back to that common vocabulary, semantic interoperability. And that is when we have this unambiguous meaning of data by some common reference model. So when you go through my checklist, you'll see we don't really have that in all cases. I've done what analysts are accused of doing so far in my talk, and I'm almost done, which is I've colored the problem quite well. But there are successes. And in my remaining time, I want to point to one. And most of you have heard about it, but it's the Afghan Mission Network, and we've studied it. And it's an important case. If you're unfamiliar with it, this is the system that that was created to allow coalition partners to share mission data. Important things like where are IEDs located. The swivel chair interoperability was too slow because what was found out was that information that was needed to conduct missions was not passed fast enough that way. But the success of that network was they figured out how to get around some of these interoperability issues. They got around the security boundaries by just getting rid of them and having one new security boundary. That's one way of getting everybody past security issues. And they got around semantic interoperability because they created translators. So the Canadian Battleview system could talk to the American CPOP system. It was a very practical approach, but I'm not focusing on what they developed, but how they got there. It really took years to sit down and get everyone in the room and agree to come up with a workable solution. So they got the stakeholders in to describe what barriers they were having towards not being able to put out a solution. But another aspect of their solution didn't get much attention. And it was key to their success, and it was that there was a continuous effort by a large number of people in a warehouse who set up this network, kept it running, and worked all their interoperability issues. It took a lot of work and a lot of human effort. So nothing done was cheap or quick. It was fueled by a lot of committed people, and it was learning by doing. It took years. It was a big success. But when you look at the trends in technology, the luxury of that amount of time will not afford us to do that again. It was the right approach, getting people together. But the trends are that there will be more people with smaller devices that are more capable and networked. The information environment will continue to evolve, as General Cardon mentioned, it will do so rapidly. And this is because entry costs and operating costs in the future of cyberspace will be lower than they are today. The size and weight of cyber devices is going down. People and devices will cluster in cities, very densely populated areas that the Army has to work in. And this means that more data will be available for exploitation by our own forces, but the other guy as well. And what's more vexing, the capability to exploit all of this data that's being generated will be exploited, and that will be achieved by non-specialists using inexpensive devices. And thus there will be a race operationally to see who can make the best use and the most innovative use of the data that's out there. And the race is between us, our adversary, and even neutral parties. So what does this trend mean for the Operation Army? The Army already relies on information technology, cyber, to support many tasks in support of warfighting functions, and the dependence is increasing. A brigade commander will need to respond with sufficient speed to such events, and inside the Army, the good news is the Army and the DoD are working on cloud solutions, getting down to the tactical level. So that's the good news. But there are other things that need to be done to approach these problems. So I mentioned the one case study. There are many other case studies I could highlight where bringing people together gets through difficult problems. And I would even argue that the Army has to consider further consolidation in technology and in personnel to get at the unity of effort that's really going to be needed. But when you look at the options that have been proposed by General Fogarty and others, they really boil down to this from my perspective. One is physical co-location. Allowing people to do what they do best, to innovate, to cooperate, to make do, has shown to be quite successful even in cyber, and there are other cases. And don't exclude further functional consolidation. It has value. It's important to get like-minded people together and not like-minded people not together. Not everyone gets along, and we have to recognize that. But we do need to get as few groups as possible to deal with the conflicting doctrine and the conflicting interests. And we can't forget operationally, there will always be gain-loss calculations that require people to come together and make decisions. Electronic warfare may be jamming an area or jamming a signal that the network operators need to use. We've seen that. The information operations or cyber folks may want to keep a website up. The intel folks may want to keep it down. Those decisions have to be made rapidly. And if you accept the need for functional consolidation and there is controversy with it, you still have two fundamental groups, two realms that people work in. So the way I divide it, if you think about inform and influence, the target is people, it's a psychological realm. When you think about machines and cyber and electronic warfare, it's a technical realm. And if you really want to drag this metaphor out, you can think of information as the apple and cyber and EW as the apple cart. Less controversial, but as complex, is the technical system consolidation that is occurring. This is good news. Network consolidation is key to this interoperability, breaking down the security barriers, getting that common vocabulary. And the device consolidation is already occurring. Just to stay on class, I quoted the past TechNet seminar, and Gary Martin said this, his quote, it's still on the internet. If you take the cover off a radio today, a software-defined radio, and you take the cover off a crew device, you can't tell the difference if you're peeking inside. That's real hardware convergence. Let me close. Current trends today are driving us to convergence. Proliferation of cyber and IT is moving at a pace, and literally devices are being put in people's hands. The information environment keeps changing at a rapid pace, faster than the Army's traditional processes for reconsidering doctrine, organizations, and material development. The past successes have come from people coming together to reinvent processes and overcome outdated red tape. Folks have been learning by doing, and it's successful. What the Army needs to do for its cyber forces is put the groups that work best together, physically or functionally or both. Thank you.
So as General Cardon described, really the holy trinity of Army Cyber. So Army Cyber at the top as the operational force. Army Cyber Institute is really the think tank, looking out to keep us from being surprised. I'm the third point on that, and I run a very large factory down at Fort Gordon. And in that factory, I'm responsible for doing a couple of things. I'm responsible for training and educating the soldiers and civilians that are to conduct cyber, signal, and electronic warfare operations, principally in support of General Cardon. He is my #1 customer, because that's where the majority of my force will actually be employed. I have force modernization proponent responsibilities. So that's everything from what the force will look like in conjunction with the principal stakeholders to the tools that that force needs, which are very unique, to, frankly, integrated solutions, which is, I think, the secret to success in the future. And then I'm also responsible for driving capabilities requirements in this domain for the Army. So that's really the principal buckets. To win in a complex world, Army forces must provide the joint force with multiple options, integrate the efforts of multiple partners, operate across multiple domains, and present our enemies and adversaries with multiple dilemmas. That's really important, because that's really the heart of the Army's operating concept of win in a complex world. And in regards to cyber, it specifies the following. The Army integrates maneuver in cyberspace with the other forms of maneuver to deny the enemy's ability to conduct operations in cyberspace while preserving U.S. freedom of action in that same domain. That's really important. It's not cyber for cyber's sake. It's cyber as a form of maneuver in conjunction with all the other forms of maneuver to accomplish that commander's mission. And that's really important. So if you look over the last 14 years, I would argue that the Army has deployed the best communications capability in its history. It's done pretty much everything that we've asked it to do. But we deployed it for speed. We deployed it to have the most capacity possible. And when we did that, we accepted some risk. We accepted risk in security and resiliency. And that's coming back to haunt us now. Because the reality is the threat we faced in 2001 did not have the same capabilities that he has today. And if we take the lessons learned from the last 14 years, principally in the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, and South Asia, we can take some potentially harmful lessons learned. One is that the opponents that you face are not going to have similar capabilities to you. And I think that's dangerous indeed. The Taliban certainly did not, and I would argue don't have sophisticated cyber or electronic warfare capabilities. Neither does ISIS. But if you look around the globe and you look at some of the threats that we've seen present themselves in the last couple of years, there are actors out there, regional peers, and near-peer competitors who have deployed very sophisticated capabilities. And I'm not sure that the network that we deployed and has served us so well would be as secure, as resilient against those threats as it is against an enemy that really didn't show up to the fight. So I think what we've got to understand is, first of all, DODN operations, most complex, most important operation that DoD conducts 24/7. And the reason that's so important, and to really fundamentally understand that, is because the way the American military fights, we're dependent upon ISR. We're dependent upon sophisticated mission command. We're dependent upon precision fires, joint logistics, telemedicine, all those capabilities that we can't imagine deploying to war without. And all that's at risk if we do not make fundamental change. And so we've got to understand the importance of the network. Now, if you don't take my word for it, you can take the word of a brigade commander that I met about 2 weeks ago at NIE, and this is what he said. The greatest threat I face as a brigade commander on the battlefield is not enemy tanks, snipers, or IEDs. It's defending the network. The Army is currently facing potential adversaries who are adapt a cyber attack, he continued. The enemy has every capability we have, and he will be attacking us in any future conflict. How we try to defend ourselves and not allow him to corrupt the network will be crucial to determining the outcome, that brigade commander predicted. So again, that's straight off of the Fort Bliss Bugle from last week. And we had the opportunity, I traveled out to NIE with the G3 of the Army, had a chance to talk to that brigade commander, his battalion commanders, and the rest of the staff. And I'll tell you, I think he's nailed it correctly, because he understands our dependency on that network. And not only does he understand our dependency on the network, but the threat has had 14 years to look at us and watch us and understand our TTP and understand our dependency on that network. So in one of my hats at the Cyber Center of Excellence, I'm responsible to lead the Army Warfighting Challenge number 7, which is to conduct space and cyber electromagnetic operations and maintain communications. And here's the problem statement. How does the Army, in conjunction with the joint, intergovernmental, multinational, and our commercial partners, assure access to critical data and information networks across multiple domains that are operating in an increasingly contested and congested operating environment while simultaneously denying the same to the enemy? Pretty simple task, right? Absolutely very complex, very complicated. But when you go back to the requirement to win in a complex world, Army forces must provide the joint force with multiple options, integrate the efforts of multiple partners, operate across multiple domains, and present our enemies and adversaries with multiple dilemmas. Information dominance is absolutely essential to our ability to meet that requirement. And that's what we're talking about. And I don't think we want to cede information dominance to our adversaries. And again, it goes back to the fundamental change that's required. So when I look at effective cyber, I look at effective cyber being the effective integration of cyber, of signal, of intelligence, of electronic warfare, of information operations, and fires. And so when we talk and we use the term convergence, that's really what we're trying to get after. So let me talk to you about the threat capabilities. What we've seen at a very sophisticated level being employed in the recent past is the ability to take comment mapping, ELINT mapping, social media scraping, offensive electronic warfare capabilities, human intelligence, imagery intelligence, or otherwise known as geospatial intelligence, and fuse that real time and to deliver very decisive and very precise fires. And it's happening on a daily basis. And luckily it's not happening to us in Afghanistan or Iraq, or that might force us to change much faster. But it's happening in Europe today, it has potential to happen in Asia at any given time, because the threat understands that space. And they're deploying capabilities to disrupt our advantage, whether it's our precision navigation and timing, whether it's our ability to operate with assured connectivity through satellite jamming and other offensive electronic warfare capabilities. It's the combination and the integration of that intel, that comms, that electronic warfare, and those cyber capabilities, what we would call CEMA, cyber electromagnetic activities, that they're actually employing. And they're not spending hundreds of millions of dollars on programs to join all this together. It's very fundamental, and it's very basic convergence by co-location in many cases. And so it's been very, very effective for them. And if you look at our vulnerabilities, which are also our dependencies, an expeditionary army requires significant amount of satellite bandwidth. We're very dependent upon satellite communications. We're very dependent with precision fires on precision navigation and timing. We're very dependent upon our network, very dependent upon our ability to have those assured communications. Aerial ISR is something we've grown very dependent upon. And in each of those, tremendous capabilities, but also tremendous vulnerabilities against the threat capabilities that I described. So as we look ahead, and I put on multiple hats, I have a requirement to recruit, train, and retain the most capable cyber warriors, whether they're in the Signal Corps, the Intel Corps, in the cyber branch. There are 29s working electronic warfare, or our 30s working information operations, or 13s that are working fire support. But it's not only train them as individuals, but train them into that whole that we talk about in convergence. I also have a responsibility for the Army to identify capabilities gaps. And we work that with Army Cyber Institute, and the other stakeholders. And some of our critical capabilities gaps include cyber situational awareness, defensive cyberspace operational tools, unified cyber platform, offensive electronic attack capabilities, and SEMA collaboration tools. So as we're working to move toward convergence, we're working to deliver these capabilities to the Army, not for cyber, but in order to have capabilities that we can integrate with other forms of maneuver to deny the enemy's ability to conduct operations in cyberspace while preserving U.S. freedom of action. Those are the big ticket items for us. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, sir. Hey, again, Colonel Joe Hartman, commander of the 780th MI Brigade. As was pointed out, we have the Army's offensive cyber teams that support various people, and we'll kind of talk through that. We also have a couple of national cyber protection teams that work for Major General Nakasone, and then a National Guard CPT that's helping us do some stuff at our headquarters. I'm going to briefly cover three areas in my opening remarks. The first is kind of where we are from an offensive side with the build of the Army Cyber Mission Forces that fall underneath the brigade. The second is to highlight the progress that we've made with our collective training programs. And then the last thing is just to touch on the pilot program that we're currently executing with Army Cyber to integrate cyberspace capabilities at the corps level and below. Just to preface all this, there's a lot of frustration sometimes with kind of where we are from a national policy standpoint with cyber. And I'd just kind of like to offer the brigade commander's point of view. And from the brigade commander's point of view, we're moving out on a lot of initiatives. I think we're doing a lot of good things for the Army and the Joint Force. From the CMF build standpoint, we've made tremendous progress this year building out the Cyber Mission Force. We have pieces of 24 teams that have been built or are currently being built to include combat mission teams supporting CENTCOM, AFRICOM, EUCOM, and PACOM. We have national mission teams and national cyber protection teams supporting the Cyber National Mission Force. We have a National Guard CPT supporting our Joint Mission Operations Center at Fort Meade. 4 of those teams have completed their build, and over the next 12 months we'll complete the build out of 16 additional teams and then bring 4 fiscal year 16 teams to what we call initial operating capability. This includes the 1st Army detachments in Texas, which is the detachment that will support EUCOM, and then a Army detachment in Hawaii, which will support PACOM. From a collective training standpoint, we've really made great strides in our ability to execute quality training events for our teams. We've established facilities at both Fort Meade, Maryland, and at Fort Gordon, Georgia, that allow us to really place an entire team in a collective training environment and execute the same tasks that they would be required to execute in support of combat operations. This includes the physical space for a team. It includes space for an opposing force. It includes space for a white cell. It includes access to the right networks that allow them to reach across something that sort of looks like a simulated internet, to a persistent training environment that sort of looks like what their potential target would look like. And it gives us the ability to continue to increase the complexity, as a team meets certain training gates. So again, if we have a cyber mission team who has a requirement to execute a mission in support of a combatant commander, our goal is to be able to go to that combatant commander and tell him that, hey, we know we can execute this with the precision that's required because we've done it X number of times in a training environment. And that goes from the collective training of the sub-elements to the collective training for the entire teams. And there really has been tremendous progress, across the Army in order to do this. Additionally, we built a group of cyber assessors who certifies that team is able to execute its mission in accordance with those standards laid out by Cybercom under the supervision of our Chief Warrant Officer and some other very technically experienced individuals in our organization. And I'll tell you, it's really a pretty high standard that we're training those teams to. We have integrated these teams with Joint Force Headquarters, and so whenever we do an exercise, as General Cardon pointed out, the Army has a Joint Force Headquarters at Fort Gordon, and every key component of a collective training event is how do we integrate into that Joint Force Headquarters, and how do we ensure that our mission command is appropriate to the mission that's required. From a 780th standpoint, because we have teams that are also aligned against other combatant command requirements, we also routinely work with the Air Force Joint Force Headquarters and are starting to work with the Joint Force Headquarters from Fleet Cyber as we stand up those teams. I think there's some myth out there that the services are not talking to each other and we're not connected, and I'll tell you that's not true. When we executed our training event for our teams in Texas that support UCOM, that team was working for an Air Force Joint Force Headquarters. They had to modify the TTPs to ensure that we were able to talk to the Air Force in language that the Air Force understood, although we were an Army force delivering that capability. So from my standpoint, that's a pretty good news story. Over the last 12 months, we've supported 3 different combatant commander exercises, delivering a capability from an Army facility here in CONUS to support both targets that were in CONUS and targets that were OCONUS. Again, great support from Army Cyber and from INSCOM in resourcing those facilities that allow us to do that. From my perspective, the Army has done a really good job of setting us up for success. And back to the joint piece again, we routinely train with our sister services both at Fort Meade and Fort Gordon, as well as our teams that are at the detachments. Currently in our headquarters, Building 310 up at Fort Meade, we've got an exercise going on right now that's really in support of the National Mission Force. We have 2 Air Force teams inside the Joint Mission Operations Center in our headquarters. We've got an Army team at another facility tied in with that element, and then we've got assessors, not only from the Air Force, but we've got assessors from Army teams as well. And I'll tell you, wherever we're doing an exercise, if you go in and look at those exercises, there's really participation from across the services. And again, from my standpoint, that's a pretty good news story. Again, General Cardon touched on the cyberspace support to corps level and below. When I found out I was taking command of the 780th MI Brigade, I figured, I know a little bit about cyber stuff, right? So the brigade headquarters is at Fort Meade next to NSA Washington. I have another battalion down at Fort Gordon, Georgia, NSA Georgia, and I knew we were standing up detachments that were somewhat co-located with the NSA facilities in San Antonio, Texas, and in NSA Hawaii. But I'll tell you, I've spent a large portion of the last year going to places like Fort Bragg and Fort Hood and Fort Bliss and the Joint Readiness Training Center and the National Training Center as we've worked with Army forces on integrating the cyberspace capability to achieve the effects that a commander is trying to achieve on the battlefield. And from us, it's really been a good news story. The goals of the pilot were to define what cyber capabilities to integrate at the corps level and below, determine the expeditionary capability required to support our deployed tactical forces, leverage our combat training centers and operational deployments to inform TRADOCS.MILPF development, and then determine what is the enduring requirements at the combat training centers. We trained with the 3rd Brigade 25th ID, Colonel Scott Kelly and his team, both out in Hawaii, then when they executed a rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center. We executed a pilot with the 75th Ranger Regiment during their task force training exercise down in San Antonio and Camp Bullis. We've trained with the 82nd, 4th ID, 1 AD, 5th Special Forces Group, and we've brought 8 different elements from across the Army to Fort Meade to go through a week-long live environment training program. And generally, a lot of good lessons came out of that. At JRTC, the BCT was successfully able to deliver cyber effects during both their wide area security and the combined arms maneuver phases. You know, we are able to integrate cyber-enabled ISR in order to ID enemy use of social media as ISR fires in medium and urban areas. You know, with the Rangers, we really had an interesting problem set because those forces generally operate on a much tighter timeline than we operated at JRTC with 3rd Brigade 25th ID. And so in some cases, we were able to have to identify a requirement, modify a tool, and then present a capability in sometimes hours. I think the shortest kind of flash to bang was 2 hours. And so again, in order to do that, you know, it really required us to look at how do we deploy a capability that provides us the ability to rapidly develop something to integrate into a maneuver commander's plan. A good event for us. We're currently out at Joint Base Lewis McChord with 22 Stryker Brigade and the 201st EMIB executing their train up for NTC rotation that will occur in January at the National Training Center. Has really been some good work, and we were able to get a little bit further ahead of this rotation than we were with the JRTC rotation. So from the initial planning prior to the D-180 to participation in LTP, and now the products that have come out of LTP actually being used for the 2-2 train up out at JBLM. And from our standpoint, we believe that the rotation will provide us really a better ability to kind of further integrate with the other elements on the battlefield. You know, we've talked about interoperability, and from a cyber standpoint, you know, the expeditionary cyber teams that we're deploying are going to be fully integrated with the MFT from the 201st, with the human collection teams, the CA PSYOPs teams, and then the maneuver units. And ultimately, you know, it's the synergy between those elements that we believe is going to be the most important. The other piece coming out of JRTC was just how do we better integrate with the intel elements to ensure that we have the intel support that's required in order to fully integrate that capability at the BCT. Really great support from the 201st EMIB and the IOF out there at Fort Lewis in order to provide the reach support, just like we would if we were deploying a unit forward into combat. You know, we are going to have that reach element back in CONUS providing them support, and we're going to replicate that for this next rotation. The other just really final piece to highlight about this CSCB initiative is that it's really helping us get after innovation. You know, what we're really finding is when we take these highly technically trained and really gifted cyber soldiers, and then we place them down at a maneuver element. You know, those requirements aren't long term. You know, there's a problem that presents itself, and the element's got to solve that problem because they've got to move out and make LD. And so it's really, from my standpoint, it's allowing us to employ capabilities in ways that we didn't necessarily envision before doing that. And so I'll leave it at that.
So thank you very much. I'm Paul Nakasone. I have the honor of commanding the Cyber National Mission Force. And I would like to offer, first of all, my thanks to AUSA and General Kernan and Army Cyber, General Cardon. Good to see Dr. Pete Singer now after his book has been published, and certainly all of my distinguished panelists today. I thought the topic today of convergence was a perfect one because I want to talk just very briefly, because I suspect that Twitter is fairly busy right now and the tweets are piling up. But let me talk a little bit about convergence from the perspective of someone who has maneuver forces operating in cyberspace every single day. Because I think what we're seeing today is indicative of what convergence has had with regards to an impact on actors, with an impact on adversaries, and with an impact on the overall ecosystem in which we operate. As General Kernan mentioned, you know, Secretary Carter has been a tremendous supporter of cyber, and the department as a whole, as we take a look at it, has made a tremendous investment in cyber. If you look back and you consider all that has been done over the past 3 to 5 years, you see the development of doctrine, the development of strategies, you see the development of forces. In fact, you know, a build that many of the panelists today have talked about of 133 teams, 6,200 personnel, split over many locations, actually building a maneuver force that's akin to brigade combat teams, carrier strike forces, all the other elements that we have to maneuver in the different domains. And then, of course, the headquarters that have also been stood up to be able to command and control these maneuver forces today. So if you take a look at the Cyber National Mission Force, 39 teams, 4 locations, 3 maneuver elements, national mission teams that operate in adversary networks. You have national cyber protection teams that defend Department of Defense networks and other non-DoD networks when authorized. And then national support teams, the elements that bring together the planners, the developers, the linguists, the people that can broach offense and defense and offense. And if you take a look at the broad mission that is given to the department, when you take a look at defending the Department of Defense information networks or providing full spectrum operations and planning support to different Joint Force commanders, or you take a look at the mission that the Cyber National Mission Force has, which is preventing disruptive and destructive cyber attacks against the homeland and our allies, you get a consideration for how convergence has really impacted a number of players as we look at cyberspace today. As we look at cyberspace today from the actors, let me talk a little bit about our teams, the Army teams, because I think this is a fairly good picture as you think about what does a maneuver force look like that the Army is building. So as I mentioned, 3 different maneuver elements that the Army is building for the Cyber National Mission Force. We have 11 of these teams. It's a millennial force. It's a young force led by a very old baby boomer, but a very young millennial force. And it's interesting to see that as you look at this construct of teams, they're roughly about 80% military, 20% civilian. They're well connected. About a quarter of them speak foreign languages. About a third of them speak different computer languages. They are well educated and they are well trained. Consider this, if you are operating within any of the teams that the Army is building, you're going to have somewhere along the lines of foundational training with Major General Fogarty. You're going to come to the National Mission Force or to Army Cyber, and you're going to have anywhere between 10 months and 27 months of very, very sophisticated training to get you ready to defend, to operate on net, to operate in adversary networks. This is a very, very professional force that our Army has put together. But returning to this idea of convergence, let's talk a little bit about the actors, because it was interesting to note what Dr. Singer said about the number of different nation states today that are looking at cyber. If you look at the Wall Street Journal on Monday, great article in terms of what are the cyber actors and what are the cyber arms that are being developed. You know, interesting to note that the Wall Street Journal said 29 countries now have formal military or intel units that are operating on the offensive side. There are 50 countries that are purchasing off-the-shelf capabilities, and perhaps most disconcerting, 24 countries with really advanced cyber weaponry. And as we think about, you know, the actors, we also have to think about how about those adversaries out there. And Major General Fogarty talked about a number of the different trends that we've seen with regards to sophistication, the complexity, the abilities of these actors and adversaries to operate within cyberspace. But let me give you another factor that we're seeing as we maneuver in cyberspace, and many of you have also probably seen. Adversaries also understand the idea of cheap, fast, and easy. In fact, if you look back at 2015, I think many of you would say, we have a number of different examples of cheap, fast, and easy, where adversaries are exploiting known vulnerabilities, where they're leveraging phishing attacks, where they're able to take privately or private information and be able to craft a very, very sophisticated spear phishing attempt to get access. There are no requirements in this cheap, fast, and easy environment for 0 days because you get access so easily. And it's also interesting to see that in this past year, what have we seen with regards to our Army, our soldiers, our families, but the stealing of PII, the scraping of websites that, as Major General Fogarty has mentioned, and the targeting of soldiers and their families on net. If you think about cheap, fast, and easy for us, we're on the wrong side of the cost curve. Because in many ways, we're not operating cheap, fast, and easy. We're on the slow, expensive, and hard ways of doing business. But if I talk about cheap, fast, and easy, I have to give equal play to the idea of how far our adversaries have come. think about what we've seen from the realm of what can be done in cyberspace. We began with this idea of, cyber actors are very interested in exploitation. This is traditional intelligence work where data is stolen, information is garnered. And then the spectrum moves to disruption. 2012, we see our financial industry in a series of denial of service attacks that take place. And then to the outer extreme on the spectrum, this idea of destructive cyber capabilities. Again, to the point that General Fogarty had mentioned, as you take a look at the destructive capabilities that are growing within our adversaries, but also not the capabilities that are growing, but the intent and the actual usage of destructive capabilities in our own nation. Whether you take a look at the Sands Casino in February 2014, or you take a look at the Sony attacks in November of 2014, what do you come away with? I think you come away with that this is an adversary that can get access, that is making an impact, that is doing such things as targeting very sensitive information. You will recall during the Sony attacks that hundreds and thousands of emails were published, dropped into pastebin for many to read. The stealing of intellectual property, the films of Sony Pictures Entertainment released before they were going to be released, and the idea of an adversary being able to get into a network, rest in that network, and then deploy destructive malware to a very, very destructive capability in the tunes of $300 million in current costs, and we're still probably going to calculate the future costs as we go through litigation and we see what happens in the future. The other piece of destructive capabilities, I would say, as we take a look at our adversaries is what our boss, Admiral Rogers, has talked about, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and director of NSA. Is in recent testimony, he talked about the idea of, hey, we're finding malware in our critical infrastructure. Now, is this malware that we're finding a message that's being sent to us by our adversaries that in times of conflict, that this is something that could be deployed? It's obviously very, very concerning as we think about the future. And as we take a look at where convergence is driving our adversaries, there is no turning back with regards to the capabilities, the destructive nature, and the abilities that they will have as the months and the years pass. The last part I'd like to talk about is something that has really taken myself personally of interest, and I think many of us that have operated within cyberspace over the past several years, and that's this idea of, and this demonstration of, the growth and the importance of the private sector in terms of influencing cyberspace. Now, we within the Department of Defense normally think that the world begins and ends with our networks, but as we know, we're a very, very small part of the global infrastructure, the global internet. And if you take a look at the vast majority of the internet, the vast majority of cyberspace, it's privately owned, as we all know. And the private sector plays a tremendous role, a primary role in determining what the future of this ecosystem looks like. So as we think about what we've learned over the past several years, one of the things that does strike me is this, this initial foray by the private sector into very, very sophisticated information. As we looked at Mandiant in February of 2013, releasing APT-1, the Advanced Persistent Threat 1, that talked about Unit 61398. Now, as an intelligence officer formerly, and I take a look at that and I read the reports, you would say, this is incredible, the telemetry that they have, the data that they're receiving, the ability to place themselves in different countries, and it's all released at what? At an unclassified level. This is what's driving a lot of what we're learning today in terms of our adversaries. It's driving as we think about how we hunt within our networks. It's driving how we think about our adversaries, because this provides tremendous, tremendous opportunities. So as we think of those ideas, I would just offer really 4 thoughts in closing to what does this impact have with regards to the Army. I think the first thing that we have to understand as we think about cyberspace today and tomorrow is the idea that it really is truly all about partnerships. So we have a look at cyberspace in general, we are a part of it, but as we take a look at these partnerships, the partnerships are the interagency, they're our allies, they're academia, they're industry. These are the partnerships that make you successful as you maneuver within cyberspace. I think the second thing that I would offer is we as an Army have to take a page and a lesson learned from our adversaries. What's cheap, fast, and easy look like for us? Because cheap, fast, and easy on the other side doesn't look too good, particularly for someone who's seen it in cyberspace over the past several years. The third thing, and I would echo what many of our panelists have said today, is that the threats are real, They're tangible. They're not going to go in reverse. What we're seeing our adversaries to do, whether or not it's on one end of the spectrum or it's on the very, very far end of the spectrum, is what we're going to see in the future. And then finally, I think, to the point that was made about commanders and commanders' business, it does come back to commanders' business. This is all commanders' business. They'll drive convergence. They'll be the ones that receive the impacts of convergence. We begin with this idea that commanders have a central role to play in cyberspace. I think that's an important one that we all remember. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, we've got a series of really important perspectives and viewpoints brought onto this, and I've gotten a number of questions both online and from the cards. And I'm going to warn the panel that I see my job as moderator is to actually sharpen these questions and make them even tougher for you. They were tough to begin with, but I'm going to make them a little bit more pointed. So let's kick it off. Disruption is become a buzzword in the Pentagon, not just in discussions of cybersecurity, but overall. And we've heard from Secretary Carter and Undersecretary Kendall in terms of we're seeking out the disruptive. And this is why we've got the initiatives reaching out to Silicon Valley and the like. And disruptive, though, has two meanings to it. It has the idea of grabbing the new, what breaks the mold. And many of you represent this literally in your organizations. But there's a second part of the meaning of disruption and disruptive that we have a harder time wrestling with, and that's getting rid of the old. So in Silicon Valley, a disruptive idea was, I'm going to, from a writer's perspective, a company came up with the idea of selling books online. Isn't this great? More efficient, more effective. But it also meant getting rid of brick and mortar bookstores. The last large one is now out of Washington, D.C. So you've talked about all of these great new disruptive ideas and approaches. What over the next 5 years do we need to get rid of?
I mean, boy, what are you doing?
So the civilian jumped into the fray first. Okay.
It's because I'm not trained. I can tell you what won't go away, but we wish it could, or I'll speak for myself. Analyzing wish it could, and that is, when it comes to information sharing, backward compatibility is just, it's what makes everything hard. If we could redesign every communication system, they would always be compatible. Our databases would speak the same language. We can't. We have equipment that will stay in the field a very long time. Everyone in this room knows about how long SINGARS has been in the Army. We're just not going to be able to remove a lot of the old legacy equipment. So that's my Santa Claus wish. I'm not going to get it, but that's an answer to your question.
So we've had this problem before. Right outside of the 780th headquarters is where, at the time, Major Eisenhower, Major Patton were experimenting with tanks, and they were called by the head of the infantry school, told them to knock it off. There was no future. There'd be no future for them. And it's kind of instructive when the headquarters was built that it happens to sit on that ground. So it did take us a while to get rid of the horse cavalry, all the way up to World War II, but it has happened. But I'd argue what's different today is that the last 14 years have created a generation of leaders that are much more innovative and adaptive. The department did an incredible job over that time delivering capabilities, some that worked, some that didn't. And you could tell which ones they were. The ones that worked were part of our operations. The ones that weren't, you could see them in connexes all over Iran and all over Iraq and Afghanistan. But so I can't tell you what's going to go away, but I can tell you it's going to be different. And what's going to put pressure on this is cost. So as the Army gets smaller, I think you're going to see greater pressure on where are the investments that we need, and part of those investments is to get rid of the structures, organizations, maybe even platforms that we have. There's going to be an element of risk in this too, because there's a lot of times we hedge risk by, we want to hold on to it as commanders inherently, because you want to have as many options as possible, and you may no longer have that luxury. You may be forced into that. My final comment on that is what's going to drive that is what Joe talked about, which is training. Hard training will tell us what we need and what we don't need.
So I would offer that first of all we have to get rid of the stovepipes, and you hear many people talk about that. But I think what we're seeing in this domain, as we look to the future, what the Intel core, the Signal core, the Cyber core, the EW core, IO core looks like in the future is going to be very different than what it is today. We talk about convergence, and the way I describe it is I kind of break it down into three pieces. And it really is, right now there are about 5 or 6 signal cores, depending on how you count, at the BCT level. And we've got to converge. There's got to be one signal core responsible for that comms transport. And when we do that, we're going to be able to shed a lot of the weight, the baggage, the complexity, frankly, a network that's almost indefensible because no one has visibility over all of it. So when we start to think about convergence, I think that is one of the big ideas. Data. We've moved from, or we're moving from where every warfighting function or battlefield operating system has its own data stovepipe. And that's absolutely essential because we're never going to be able to use big data analytics or even start to reach the potential of analysis that could occur the way we're currently configured. Gary Martin, Steve Kreider lead a tremendous effort at PEOC3T to doing that. And then organizationally, I'm not arguing that we're going to create some amorphous staff officer, but what I'm arguing is that we need to break down the barriers, which really is information sharing, some of it's classification, and move more to the JSOC-like model. And that's going to require some fundamental change. People are going to have to get the right clearances. They're going to have to, so we're going to have to make investments in that. We're going to have to work the policy to make the information a lot easier. And then I think with our multinational partners, what we've come to appreciate is we're not fighting anywhere without them. For our Five Eyes partners, it's much easier, but it's not anywhere as good as it needs to be. And with the ones that are not Five Eyes, we've got some fundamental changes that we're going to have to make to really reach kind of that goal of convergence.
So I think that as we take a look at it, where I don't know if necessarily get rid of is the right word, but where we spend a lot of time thinking about is talent management. So we take a look, and we firmly believe at the end of the day that our soldiers are what makes us really effective. I think that we're going to have a very, very dedicated look at personnel procedures, how we're going to advance people, how we're going to pay people, how we're going to retain people. The Army has been at the forefront and doing much of this over the past 2 years as we take a look at the development of a branch, the abilities and the power that's given to Army Cyber Commander in moving select soldiers. But I think overall we're going to face a point in time as we train more and more of our soldiers, and these soldiers come up for their decision point, whether or not they're going to stay in or they're going to get out. And I think that we're going to have the flexibility of mind, the flexibility of organization to say it's a little bit different. And how you get promoted and how you advance and how you get paid is a little bit different because your skills are so valuable to us as an Army.
Hey sir, just to comment, we talked about, grabbing the new and getting rid of the old, and kind of the third option is how do you better utilize the capability that you already have. And so, not getting into exactly what missions teams are aligned against, but, all the teams look alike for the most part. All the combat mission teams look alike, all the combat support teams look alike, all the national mission teams and national support teams look alike, kind of regardless of service. And I think eventually what we will get to, and we're still in the build, is that that maybe a team that has mission X doesn't need to look exactly like a team that has a mission support and a different requirement. And even internal to the cyber mission force, once we get through the build, that we have opportunities to kind of reorganize internally to get after those missions that we have now that maybe weren't there when we originally envisioned building this force.
So it's interesting, you used the historic parallel of a young Eisenhower and a young Patton, and you began with Twain's quote on new ideas, and there was the other famous quote that is at least attributed to Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So you've put on the table one historic parallel that you keep in mind in leading your organization. I'd like to ask each of you, what are other, so you can't use young Eisenhower, what are other historic parallels, for better or for worse, that you apply in your role and you think could be instructive for us?
So I think the 73 war was very instructive for the Army. You think back to it generated so much momentum. So we had to shake loose of the ghost of Vietnam. We actually had a tangible threat that we could orient on, and it drove programs that are serving us actually well today. One of the most important programs it drove was actually a fundamental shift in the way we trained, assessed ourselves to get to the force we were when we went to the desert in '91. We went back to the desert in 2001 and 2003. And so I think we're at that point now where we're moving from COIN. We can't abandon it. I'm not being an advocate for that, but we're looking at what the other threats are out there. The AOC, I think, was vitally important. A slide that I use on a frequent basis, really most of our slides, we start with the AOC. We think that's such a fundamental document for us. So you think back to air-land battle and the doctrine of operations for the Army. That's what guided how we're going to operate. And I think what General Perkins and the team, General McMaster's, that whole team at TRADOC have done, they've given us that concept that we can organize around. And I think that's, as I look back, and we actually did some work with some foreign partners over the summer, that's what I really reflected back to, is that fundamental shift. They got the Army oriented. I think in this space, this has been very, very useful. The way the AOC describes the environment, the uncertainty of the environment, and certainly some of the actions that we're seeing from the enemy, real-world capabilities, not notional capabilities.
Others?
I think for the historical analogy I would offer is, again, to the point of creation of special operations forces in the late 80s. We do take a lot of lessons as we look and see there were some very, very key concepts that make a lot of sense to us. This idea of experimentation, this idea of talent management, this idea of one standard for training. So whatever maneuver unit you're going to get, you understand that that training standard is a joint standard that will ensure that you have a level of confidence in the units that you're employing. I think that's the one that, Dr. Singer, that I think about as we think about analogies.
And from my standpoint, really in that same vein, I spent a lot of time as the J2 of the Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan, both early and late. So early in the war and then late in the war. And early in the war, we had this really high-end capability, but it wasn't integrated as well as it could be with the rest of the maneuver force that was actually operating in the space. And so while we could achieve high-end effects, it was those high-end effects not being integrated across the battle space didn't necessarily create the effect we were looking for. In cyber, we have a lot of really high-end capabilities right now. But those high-end capabilities haven't necessarily been integrated as well as they could. And so from our standpoint, we've talked about this cyberspace support to core and below, but it's also the integration with, as General Cardon referenced, the Army Joint Force Headquarters. So the Army Joint Force Headquarters, a very robust capability down at Fort Gordon, Georgia, that really gets after that piece to ensure these high-end cyber capabilities are integrated into the combatant commanders' plans that they're supporting. And I'll tell you, we're not there across all the different combatant commands right now, but from a historical standpoint, I think we're kind of early in OIF right now.
I will point to the creation of the Air Force, and that's a little bit of an easy one, but it's important to remember. Right now, the Army has a branch. That's a big victory. 5-10 years ago, that was not considered even a possibility. So it's still shocking to me that this is occurring. But one of the things you get when one organization needs to move out and form its own cadre is you get people thinking of innovative ways to apply their craft. And so the really incredible things that are going to come out of cyber, and there are great things going on now, will occur once this cadre, once this 1,000 grows to 2,000, and they can all sit together. So there comes a time when you have to take a group of folks and break them out into their own separate group so they can do their separate thinking and really start to write the doctrine that's going to be used in the far future.
Great. So another questioner points out that an Abrams tank runs on 2 million lines of software code. Bradley runs on 1.5 million lines of code. And they asked the panel to address the cyber threat to the platforms. More broadly, we can see one of the fundamental changes in this space is the creation of the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything, where depending on your count, somewhere between 20 to 200 billion new objects will be coming online by the year 2020. Objects ranging from Abrams tanks to refrigerators to cars to things not yet invented. So how do you look at this fundamental shift in essence, both the network but also the overall operating environment?
That's an easy question. So I'm not going to address. So we're the offensive guys. So I'm going to kind of turn that question around and just address it from a enemy system standpoint. And so for us, what we are trying to do right now is look at kind of who we partner with kind of across the community. And so for us, we've been very dependent on our NSA partners, and we'll continue to do so. And if you look at where we're located, we're located where the NSA has facilities. But, we all look at the same kind of commercial products, right? At the end of the day, though, when we talk about military systems, we need to better align ourselves with those organizations that look at vulnerabilities in military systems. And so when we talk about, the organization moving forward, we need to be better partnered with research laboratories and the National Ground Intelligence Center and those organizations that kind of have the charter to look after those things. Because certainly the vulnerabilities exist.
I'm going to press you on that. You have an opportunity to do something that battlefield commanders couldn't do in the past, which is not only can you block communication or destroy the object, but now you have the potential to manipulate the object, to change it. How are you thinking through that when you've got these new capabilities? I think that's one of the things that people would be interested in that's being introduced by the Internet of Things.
Yeah, so, for us, we're presenting a range of capabilities to maneuver commanders, and then that maneuver commander kind of gets the vote and what is the effect that he's looking to achieve.
So I would argue it's not necessarily the technology, it's the culture. So I think this is a huge win. The greatest threat I face as a brigade commander on the battlefield is not enemy tanks, snipers, or IEDs. Now, I didn't say those are unimportant, and at certain points they may be more important, but he recognizes what the threat is. There are probably brigade commanders in the Army who may not know that there's a 1 million line code for an M1 tank or 1 million for a Bradley, or even think about that. So part of it's going to be the education in order to be able to really understand what the potential is and actually understand what the threat is. So part of it's education, part of it's a cultural change that is going to have to occur. And we've got to have that discussion really at the appropriate level. But if this is truly commander's business, they're going to have to grip this in a way that, frankly, we've probably never seen before. I mean, I think things have changed dramatically. Certainly when you were brigade commander in the 82nd, you didn't have a single IP device. You had combat radio networks that were vitally important. But you look at what a brigade commander in the 82nd has today. He's bringing mobile GSM capability, he's bringing satellite capability, soldier waveforms. His requirement to interact with interagency partners, it's unbelievable. But fundamentally, we haven't really changed the structure of the staff that supports that, who informs that. We're not teaching that probably at the level we need to in the institution, and it's got to start with, I have a great command sergeant major. I mean, this is our discussion. We have to start this at a very early age, and it's not just the officers. It's got to be across the entire force.
So Pete, I'd offer three thoughts. One is, those same systems that you referenced there can operate degraded. And when we build systems in the Army, they should be able to operate in a degraded mode. So you always have some sort of capability. It's not going to be as good as it is if it has all of it, but it can still fight. The second part is there's a degree of resiliency. that has to be built into the system. So even when compromised, it's, you and I had an earlier conversation, is how fast can you bring it back online? And I think there's a danger to think that we're going to be able to defend things all the time. And so that's why resiliency...
Do you think that's being built into the acquisitions process right now?
Well, I think, so yes, because I think it's being driven by Secretary Carter. I think we're closer to the front of that than the end, and some systems are incredibly hard for other reasons. But the danger here is that you look at it solely from maybe one point of view and not the way that an offensive team would look at it. And you saw this, I think, even on the 60 Minutes. Like the way they went into those cars was not the way that the automotive manufacturers envisioned them to go into they couldn't envision that that's the way that they would hack into those cars. And so, to me, if we recognize that it's competitive space, intellectually we always recognize that we should look hard at how we test in a contested space, because if we don't, we'll miss a vitally important piece that won't be caught by the innovative nature of the people that are the high-end personnel in this space.
Now, you have an interesting perspective in both working with the military and cybersecurity, but also this transportation studies background. How do you see the cross between those two in this space?
But, it's what General Cardon says. You have to recognize the threat, and then you can deal with it.
Does the Army sufficiently recognize the threat?
Well, I think we all do at this point. The question is, to what extent did we do 3 decades ago? I'll focus on the automotive industry. There have been in-vehicle car networks for 3 decades. I mean, look it up. I mean, even more. In the 1970s, the Cadillac had an in-vehicle network. But the first ad I'd ever seen for a job opening at a car company with the title Cybersecurity Engineer was last year. So what happened over the last 3 decades? The car cycle is about 5 years to develop a car from concept to creation. On our side, it takes a little bit longer. The bottom line is, if you recognize it, you can test it, you can find where the vulnerabilities are. If you don't accept that the probability is high enough, you won't spend any time. So we're there now, and we just have to pay attention to it. But what we can't do is what happened in the automotive industry, ignore the problem and hope nobody goes after it, because we know people have.
And so when you walk the convention floor and see all the new cool gear, do you feel confident?
I have not walked the convention floor.
Oh, that's
so I'm safe.
Good dodge. Okay. This relates to another question that's been posed, which is that we're using phrases and words like interoperability and partners. And this is a panel, though, that is missing 2 things. It's missing, we're all American, and 2, there's no one who is a private military contractor. How do you assess the cybersecurity of our foreign partners and the partners that we depend on to operate, noting, for example, that in Afghanistan right now, we have, according at least to CENTCOM, 36,000 private contractors operating. At the high point in Iraq, we had just as many private military contractors. How do you assess their cybersecurity?
So I guess I'll start with that. As we take a look at our allies, I think that, as with any capability, there's a wide range of abilities and skill sets that our allies possess. I think I would offer, though, I offer the idea of not only being able to understand what their capabilities are, but more importantly, what are we going to bring to our allies in times of crisis? So think about this. What do we bring to country X when country X sees destructive malware within their networks? And that's something that we normally don't think about. We don't necessarily consider, okay, we're going to provide defensive support, or we're going to be the ones that are going to do the malware analysis, or we're going to be able to go back and have the forensics that says, hey, this is how they got in, this is how we have to prevent it. In terms of taking a look at other countries, I think a number of the combatant commands, and I've had experience in several of them, have taken a very close look at the infrastructure that supports them. And I think that, to be honest, the reply that you would get from them is concerning. They know that there are key terrain out there that they don't necessarily control, but could have a significant impact on their bandwidth, on their ability to bring logistics, on their ability to move forces. I think that that is well recognized by a number of the different planners and staff principals in several of our combatant commands. I think the more interesting thing is that the department recognizes that. And so if you take a look at the Department of Defense cyber strategy, that's one of the areas that they are looking at. What's the critical infrastructure that we have to protect, and how do we do that?
Anyone want to tackle the private military side?
Well, first I was going to say, Peter, so first it's about, you have to build relationships. So we talked about Joint Force Headquarters Cyber, but what I didn't say is we have 3 allied officers serving inside it now. And this is a big push by Admiral Rodgers about how do we get more partners just not from our partners and allies, but also how do we partner better with private industry. This is everything from Secretary Carter's initiative out in Silicon Valley. How do we better share information? Often the private industry sees many of these threats first before we see it, because not all of it obviously comes against the military first, or maybe not at all. It's actually out there, but could affect us. I think we are struggling with how do we do it with private industry given the current policies, laws, and regulations. As I've had these discussions with different members and staffers, is we have 20th century laws and policy for a 21st century world, which makes this very hard for them to do, for private industry, for liability reasons, all kinds of reasons that put up impediments, but increasingly there's this recognition that we have to work closer together. It's just the mechanism to do it easily doesn't exist yet.
There's another question that ties into this, which is, so if we think of the total force, you have the active duty, we've talked about partners, we've talked about private military contractors, private service contractors, although I think, in cybersecurity, we're mainly talking about the civilian side in terms of infrastructure, not the Halliburton KBRs that we depend on for logistics and the like. But then there's also a question about Army Reserve and National Guard, and what is their future as part of cyber missions and operations?
So we have a total force approach here. Both the Guard and Reserve invested about 1,000 personnel each. 11 cyber protection teams coming out of the National Guard, 10 coming out of the Reserve. We have to have this. One of the reasons is because many of those soldiers work in the very industries that we need to have relationships with. And Undersecretary Carson is doing a lot of work here about how do we have a better way for military personnel to move back and forth between the sectors, maybe using some sort of a different construct that takes advantage of what already exists in the Guard and the Reserve. But I think there's there's a lot of energy on this. As Joe had mentioned, we already have 1 National Guard cyber protection team. I think you'll see 3 or 4 more grow in this year, but in talking to General Talley, the Chief of the Army Reserve today, I think we might actually be able to do this much, much faster. And there's a lot of effort on this right now.
I think what's important also is they understand fundamentally that they have to meet the joint standard. So they've signed up to that. And one of the things as we're working, matter of fact, the Professional Education Center, PEC, at Little Rock, Arkansas, it's a National Guard training center. They're the ones that are actually working the ICC curriculum for the Army. And so that's been a great partnership between Cyber Center of Excellence, the National Guard, and NSA's ADAT. So when we've talked to adjutant generals, I've made the point that this is not something you can do 1 weekend a month. Your skills will atrophy very quickly. There's a long training pipeline. So you're going to have to make a commitment to this that will be somewhat different probably than the traditional Guard model, at least to get it up and started. And then I think they'll determine, based on what they're doing in their private capacity, what skills are going to be required, how much time they have to have on mission. But at the end of the day, they have to meet the joint standard to get on the network, and then they're going to have to meet it be very effective, that's going to require a pretty significant commitment.
Now, are you noticing different, you've both at the end of the table had interactions with folks in National Guard and Reserve in your current roles. What are the differences that you see that they bring to bear?
So from our standpoint, the biggest difference is they generally are bringing significant experience from the private sector into the organization. And so from our the one CPT team that we have up there at Fort Meade, they're generally a little bit older than our other Army teams, and they generally, again, have a civilian job that provides them some level of experience prior to coming into the organization. But as far as standards, the standards are the same, motivation's great, and really no difference in the force from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the piece that I would add is, so how do we help them? I think one way we help them, and a firm believer in a joint training standard and the ability for us to be able to ensure that that force is training, but one of the ways that we can help them is there should be a rapid equivalency process. So we take a look at someone that's worked at the National Security Agency for 10 years, and we don't necessarily need to send them back to a long laundry list of training that's been ongoing, or they've worked within Silicon Valley, or their antivirus work. I mean, this can be rapidly done, and I think that's something that we can help as we take a look at the future.
I'll add a couple of things, and we've got an ongoing study for Cyber Center of Excellence, so I'm not going to brief that up because I haven't briefed the boss yet, but I will say this. We found tens of thousands of people who have the potential to be brought in and trained to the standard. There's a lot of folks out there, that's obvious, but I want to point out something you hear when you talk to guardsmen and reservists. One personal experience. I mean, I once went to an exercise, I think it was Cyber Guard 14, where the guy on the red team who was hacking into the blue force, it was unfair because I recognized him. He was on YouTube. He was the guy who wrote the front end to Metasploit, and he just happened to be a reservist. It was unfair. He was cleaning up against everyone. There's a lot of talented guys and ladies that happen to be, in their day job, professional hackers, red teamers, pen testers, legal, and then they sign up for the reserve. So you have some talent out there that can be taken advantage of. And if you talk to folks who were in the Army Reserve Information Operations Command, I think it's called ARCOG now, the guy who did the forensics to catch the BTK killer was in that unit. So you have lots of folks out there that in their day job, they're professional. But it's going back to what General Fogarty and the other generals said, they've got to get the formal training to be up to military grade. It's advantageous now because, in the last few years, because we haven't had the cyber force, we haven't had the cadre, we haven't had the branch. We do now, so the picture's going to change, but there's still a potential out there of folks who do this in the daytime.
This leads to another question. They ask, actually, how much of our DoD cyber force needs to be people in uniform? Can't much of the mission be done by civilians who are not either already in the active, or the examples you're giving of people that are already in National Guard and Reserve? Wouldn't it be easier to access a wider pool if they didn't have to meet some of the various requirements, physical, medical, et cetera? Wouldn't compensation be easier? So is it, we've used descriptions of we need to get them to our training level. Is it an issue of training, or is there something else here that requires them to be in uniform?
So there's certainly authorities questions, right? We operate in Title 10 authorities, so it's a uniform chain that runs that. So that will certainly be one area that is indicative of why we need a military presence in it. When we speak of training, at least when I speak of training, I would say that we're looking at really the technical training that provides them the capacity to operate on net, to defend our networks, that necessarily gives them the utility to be a valued member of what we're going to do either offensively or defensively.
So, get asked this question quite a bit. So some observations with when we were doing the first cyber support to Corps and below, we actually, there's a belief that you can do this from afar. And what we realized on the very first experiment is, oh my gosh, we're going to have people right there, which then drives you automatically to you need some sort of military component. I also think there's a certain ethos inside the uniformed military that you need. It's more powerful when it's paired I absolutely believe we need civilians on the team, because there's also the other one, why don't you just follow military teams? But I think when you put both together, it just builds a really powerful force.
We have a question from Twitter, and it hits something, we're on this theme. I'm trying to connect the different parts together, and it hits on this theme of training. And we talk about training them up, building the ethos, the capability. The questioner asks, in essence, the inverse, which is about the various deficiencies that are out there. And we've talked about a couple of them, the idea of being able to fight degraded and the like. And this is dangerous in this setting, but there was news recently that the Navy has changed its training for its midshipmen. It's not just created a corps to feed cyber warriors into the 10th Fleet, but it's also gone back to requiring that all midshipmen learn how to do celestial navigation. So how do we need to, or do we need to change training to operate in a degraded or utterly lost level?
So we've recently, it was interesting at NIE again, so they can bring you and show you what's on the big screen, and it struck me that the division commander briefed the G3 of the Army and I on a map with acetate overlays. And they keep that up in case they lose, but that's not the principal means. So I think they've taken prudent precautions. And this is a pretty savvy commander, and he's under cyber stress, he's under electronic warfare stress on a recurring basis. But they still depend upon that network, and that's their principal ways of communicating. What they've done is they've gotten a lot better at defending it. They've gotten a lot better at understanding what the threat's capable of. They've got very capable at segmenting portions of the network off. So you don't lose everything. So talk about resilience, but it's become a battle drill for them because they're training at that level. We talked to the Army leadership actually last week to talk about offensive EW capabilities that we think we should be able to provide at the training center. So we're working our way through what that would look like. We think that, frankly, our forces have to be subjected to some of the realistic threats that I described, because that's what will force you to develop those realistic TTPs. But I think that will happen. We're in transition right now, and we're looking hard at how we would provide that realistic training environment for our forces. I think the biggest challenge is your ability to replicate that at the very lowest level on a persistent basis. So how do you do that? I think there's some models we can look at, but I still think the network's very powerful. We need to harden it to make it much more secure and resilient, and that should be Plan A. Then Plan B becomes everything else.
And I think we've grown in our sophistication as we look at our training. So as the teams become more proficient, I want to change the environment. I want to have the Black Swan event where I'm going after your tools. I want to change your data. I want to take a look at what you've been given as a network map, and I want to change it because I want to make sure that whatever you think the network looks like, it doesn't look like that at all. So those are all elements that we learned, in different places as we were growing up in the Army. It's the same here. I mean, I look at that and I say, let's change the environment so when the team has to face it, they have to go back and think, okay, so this is not what we had planned to do. It didn't survive contact, so now what do we do?
We have a question on, there have been rumors that there will be a Army cybersecurity strategy document coming out in the next month plus, and they ask for a preview of it. If we can get a preview from anyone up here. No previews?
I'll tell you how it came about. So when General Nakasone was there, we started working on a strategy for the command. Then last spring, there's a DoD cyber strategy. You heard General Fogarty talk about the triad that we have, and we realized what we didn't have was an Army strategy. We had an Army Cyber Command strategy, and we had a DoD strategy. And if we're going to be, you know, in this space, in the way we want to be in this space, we have to have an Army-level strategy that takes us on. And so this has been a rather rapid effort, and I expect to see it in the next probably 30, 60 days.
I won't ask anyone else to comment. We have a question on essentially the law side of this. This is also a panel, for better or for worse, with no lawyers on it. And yet, that's been one of the things that has been a common point of discussion over the last decade and a half is the challenges of new technologies, how they interface with the law, adversaries fighting lawfare. And the questioner essentially asks that it seems we're not going to get a new cyber Geneva conventions, that there's various challenges in terms of the norms, the operations, but the first question they have is, are we headed for a no-holds-barred, persistent warfare in this space? And then I'd like to add a second one on top of it, which is, what is your interface with the military law community, and how are we, in essence, training them up for the kind of situations and dilemmas that they'll be, in turn, advising you and those they lead on?
So first in the Army, we track, we use an identifier for those branches that have expertise in cyber, but they're going to stay the original branch. So for example, the Army lawyers we have working for us get an Echo 4 identifier. We know then they've worked in cyber before and could then, you know, perhaps go up to Cyber Command or work for the National Mission Force. That's the first one. The no holds barred, this is, you get asked, there's a number of, I think, larger questions. So the first one is you get this idea of we shouldn't build capabilities because we'll never get the authority to use them. But there's a problem is that when things happen, people say, okay, what can you do now? And if you take that, then you have nothing. And so this is one part of the debate that swirls. The other part of the debate that swirls is often when you say no hold barred, I don't use the word, I like to use the word, the space is contested and will remain contested. And the law going forward is evolving to account for that as it goes forward. So I would say the way that people looked at the legal basis before Sony and after Sony is different. The way they looked at the denial of service attacks against the banks earlier was different before than after. And so much like the law evolves in our country, it's going to evolve in this space. It's not moving at the pace people would like, but I believe that's often comes from a risk view, which is if you do this, what are the second and third order effects? So we've defined over decades, we can define kinetic risk, for example, use of artillery shells and mortars. We can define the risk, we can define collateral damage, we can define all that. That allows for better decision making on whether you should or shouldn't do something with the associated set of authorities that allows you to do it. When you start to go down the cyber, you have all kinds of questions that really can't be answered, which makes it very difficult to make the right risk determinations. And so you sometimes hear this couched in terms of, oh, it's intel loss gain or it's operational loss gain. Well, actually, that's in every operation. It's just how do you apply that to cyberspace?
Colonel, I'm going to ask you, how are you interfacing with the legal community in your role?
So internal to our staff, we do have a cyber operational lawyer, a lot of experience prior to coming to the organization. And so, you know, as you would expect, any operation we support obviously goes through a legal review. And then, you know, we have a very healthy relationship with the Army's school down in Charlottesville. And so we routinely send our guys down there. We guest lecture down there. And so I think there's actually a pretty deliberate effort by the Army to to train the JAGs that are coming out of the school to be able to operate in this environment.
Great. Well, there's a really good question, I think, to end on, and I'm going to broaden it by phrasing it this way. Sitting in this room or watching this later on online or reading about it is a young officer who will potentially be in your roles at some point in their career, or a young analyst. What advice would you give them? Not merely how to get this job, but sort of a key takeaway. And I'd like to ask each of you that.
I'm buying myself some time.
Yeah,
with this.
so-
Okay, I'm gonna, so when you're the junior guy on a panel, you know, you generally get, so for me, that, you know, we talk a lot about this. So what are we looking for cyber leaders in the Army? You know, are we looking for officers that have computer science degrees from great institutions? Yes. You know, are we looking for officers that can interact with maneuver units? Yes. You know, but the biggest thing we're really looking for is not different than any other branch in the Army or any other unit in the Army, is we're looking for great leaders. And so, you know, we got a couple of young lieutenants in here that are staring at me right now that, you know, have these fabulous technical skills, and you know what the number one thing they want to do is? You know, they want to go to Ranger School. You know, and they want to go to Ranger School because they want to gain those leadership tasks that allow them to better interface with leaders in the Army as they grow. And so for me, you know, it's not any kind of mystical qualities that we're looking for. You know, we're looking for dedicated officers who are ready to get after the mission and who are great leaders. You know, and if you come to the force and you have these fantastic technical skills, that's great. If not, we'll train you. But again, we're looking for great leaders.
So the Army looks much different at 30 years than it does at 3 years. And as you look back, and I would say providing counsel to someone that is starting out, the piece of advice that is difficult for me to imagine at 3 years, but very realistic for me at 30 years, is the fact that take a long-term approach to what you're going to look at as your career. Because quite frankly, entering the Army in the Reagan years was much different than the Army of the years right now. And so as I think about it, how far we have come even in 5 years in terms of cyberspace. 5 years ago, as U.S. Cyber Command was standing up and we were doing high fives, we had no forces, we had no headquarters, we had no branch, we had very little tools. That's all in 5 years. And so think about that as you approach the future, because events around you change quickly, and the ability to have that flexibility in mind and thought and to have an appreciation for the long term, I think serves you very well.
So I'll really just reinforce what they've said. You know, I thought about that hard. I think that yeah, I learned more in the intel field from working for leaders like General Cardon and other great combat leaders. The technical stuff is frankly pretty straightforward, but you know, what does it mean? How do you apply it against realistic requirements? And so as I look back and I go over the great leaders that I've worked with in the past, it was because I didn't stick just in the intel side. I stuck my nose out and had the opportunity to learn, absorb from the great example from a lot of other people. So again, it goes back to this idea that this is not, we're not doing it for cyber's sake or for intel's sake or for signal's sake. It's actually to create an effect for a commander. The only way you can do that is to you get out of your safe space, accept some risk, and the reward's going to be pretty darn great. And I think that's what will make the great leaders, is actually watching great leaders in action as someone that you can emulate.
So what advice would you give a civilian analyst in this space?
Probably the same advice as what I've seen from the people who've worn the uniform. I mean, I don't want to get sappy here, but people in the military who have stayed in cyber, it was before there was a branch. They knew it would hurt their career. They just dedicated themselves to the field because they appreciated it that much. And it's the same thing in industry. I mean, cyber is cool now, but the people who have the expertise, and I'm not counting myself in that mix. I'm an analyst. I'm not an operator. But the people who have it stayed in it when there was no profit, when it wasn't cool, when it didn't lead to advancement and promotion. And that's kind of the standard. Be dedicated to your field and stay in it. So that would be my advice.
So just building on that, as I look back to my first 8 years in the Army was fairly static. We had a very defined doctrine, all these platforms, and then things really started to change. So, you know, often we say in this space, what keeps people in cyber is mission. And so there's a technical component to that, because the technology of today is not the technology of 5 years from now. And if you're not willing to apply yourself on that, then you're not going to be very successful in the space. There's an operational component. It's not cyber for the sake of cyber. There's a character component. I call this is a natural curiosity, the passion for the space that Isaac just talked about. But in the end of the day, what we're talking about here is the key to cyber, which is people. At the end of the day, it's about how people are going to use the technology, the doctrine, invent the concepts, come up with the ideas that are going to enable us to prevail and win in this space.
Well, I think it's a perfect way to end. I hope you'll join me in a round of applause for them both for their insightful remarks, but what they do.